Hi everyone, morning. Thank you very much for this invitation, Scott, Carter, Clara, all the team in Tulsa. I'm really excited of being part of this launching of the Center for Heterodox Economics, and hopefully, I look forward to future collaborations to discuss within and outside the heterodoxy about real issues affecting on many angles and sides of social in society everywhere. So we have a short amount of time to talk about the political economy of Piero Sraffa. Let me begin by saying Piero Sraffa was born in Torino, Turin, Italy, August 1898, and died in Cambridge, September 1983. I have a lot of more biographical details about him, but it's not appropriate to go through all of them. However, I would like to highlight that part of his scientific and intellectual journey was affected on several occasions of his life for all the things that he went through during his trips from Italy to England, and also because of the Mussolini fascist government back in the day, and many other things that we can have some discussion afterwards. But so all these things are important. In particular, I would like to also stress that people were very important to Sraffa. In particular, I would say John Maynard Keynes. He was a close friend of Piero Sraffa's, and Piero Sraffa took John Maynard Keynes' advice very seriously. As you can see, the very first page of his Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. So all these biographical things can be put forward to, relate to his economic theory and thinking. So let me now today, giving you a broad picture of his main contributions to economics, which I sort of put in three, broad areas, like the history of economic thought, the revival of the classical political economist and Marx, which eventually turned out to be the so-called modern surplus approach. Then, of course, the critique of the marginalist economic theory, or neoclassical economic theory, or orthodox economic theory, however you want to call it. Of course, all these three big areas are intertwined, and this is not in any chronological order. Actually, he started off his journey by reading Marshall in the late 1910s in Italy, and then, in his search for the ultimate cause of cost and how to measure the prices, eventually he came across, a rereading of the classical political economist, and then, we have the surplus approach. Anyway, I will basically focus on point 2 and hopefully 3. So on the first point, history of economic thought, just to highlight that his, huge and amazing contribution to economic theory was his publication of David Ricardo's Works and Correspondence, which basically, we were talking about this before, took more than 20 years to be published, although on the contract that he had signed with the Royal Economic Society, he had promised to be published in 1 year time to John Maynard Keynes. But eventually, many things turned up in his life. Nonetheless, the fact that he discovered some letters in Ireland between Ricardo and James Mill, and actually Keynes was very much excited about this, and so he was okay to push back publication of the Works and Correspondence of David Ricardo. The main, I would say, there are a lot of contributions and discoveries in that scholarship work of Sraffa, but the introduction to the Works and Correspondence of David Ricardo was perhaps one of the most important, key, and crucial additions by Sraffa, and basically that is the place perhaps where we can retrieve the the skeleton of the surplus approach, which eventually he would, put forward in his book in 1960. Anyway, just to mention this, he was awarded the Sunderström Gold Medal by the Royal Swedish Academy of Science because of the in 1961, because of this publication. So his contribution to history of economic thought, not only fell within this, David Ricardo's publication, but other things as well, not in terms of publication, but in terms of his intellectual interest, I would say. Okay, so let's come down to the let's say, the area of the reappraisal, rediscovery of the classical political economy and Marx. And I would say this rediscovery or reinterpretation of the classical political economist from the physiocrats through Smith, Ricardo, and Marx basically came out of his critique of Marshallian theory, okay? By the mid-1920s, if you want, on paper in 1930, exactly on the Economic Journal, Sraffa said, we have to discard 100% Marshallian theory. Out of this research, which, as I have said before, actually started in the late 1910s, so it took a few years for him to discard the Marshallian theory, right, and to rediscover and put forth his way of reappraising the classical political economist and Marx. Basically, the main issue here is the acknowledgement or recognition that income distribution, the prices of the so-called factors of production cannot be explained through the supply and demand functions or marginal productivity and things like that. At that time, Sraffa was rejecting the so-called subjective disutilities of the marginalist theory by Marshall, and then he came across basically this reinterpretation of the classical political economists and Marx. Okay, so this is just, how he put forward this rediscovery, which he said, like, after criticizing Marshall's supply and demand curves for the decreasing and increasing returns, he basically said, okay, in the normal case, the cost of commodities produced competitively must be regarded as constant in respect of the small variations in the quantities. And so the simple way of approaching the problem of the value, competitive value, the old and now obsolete theory, which makes it dependent on the cost of production alone, appears to hold its ground as the best available. So this is the classical political economy, the classical value theory. And he called it obsolete because at that time, of course, it had been totally abandoned, as we know. And then, of course, this can be linked to Sraffa's papers, which we are going to talk about this hopefully in this session as well. And in some of his, of his notes in preparation for his lectures, which he would deliver in Cambridge in 1927. Eventually, it was pushed back to the next year. In these pre-lectures, so-called pre-lectures note, he actually said something in his, rediscovery of the classical political economist, and in that, journey, the discarding of the Marshallian theory. And he said something like, two standards were offered. They are the same thing, words. But in the same manuscript, you see that, however, there is one reality in cost, labor, okay? And now we come here to the fact that, okay, you may be asking yourself, oh, is it the labor embodied in the commodities? Well, this is, another piece of his notes, pre-lectures notes, 1927. It is not, actually, because what he was trying to say is, no, it's actually all the necessaries, all the goods that are needed for the workers, okay, to get into the production, into the productive process, okay? So the variations in cost in one commodity arise only from changes in the coefficients of production, namely in the proportions in which different factors enter into the productive process, okay? So all these strikes through and read are from Sraffa's original, okay? Interestingly, he said, I really like this part, he said, we must find a unit of measure for cost. The necessity for this unit arises not from a desire of actually measuring, okay? So it's not because of the technicality of measuring, you know, the willingness on the part of Sraffa is not that. It's actually, as he said, prior to it, okay? And it's required for thinking of cost, okay? So he's speaking with himself, I think, and he's trying to put foundations in his new theory that he was starting to create, actually, but with relation with the classical. So, and actually after this, he says, thus Ricardo's theory of value based on the amount of labor. I would say also Sraffa would have written Marx's theory of value as well, because Marx was, in that particular sense, also he took the labor theory of value as had been laid out by Ricardo. Two interpretations can be given. One is the subjective utility one, which actually was Marshall's, and the objective physical necessaries of existing one, which is Sraffa's. He probably had not always clear in mind, this is very important, the distinction between 1 and 2, but I believe that the latter is the one that underlies his theory of value. So this is the, I would say, the rediscovery of the classical political economist in a way which eventually will be, consistent in terms of the presentation of the theory. And of course, I don't have time to continue, but eventually in those same notes, we can already see the first layout of Sraffa's equations eventually, as you see. Here, we can produce commodity A and B by means of using commodity A and B, okay? For a subsisting economy, you have the input and the output, and then at the end of the day, he came up with this A2 equals B1, which of course, they are heterogeneous commodities and they cannot be the same, but still, we are thinking, he's thinking, about his theory of value and the connection with the classical political economics, which will reveal to be key and crucial for Sraffa's. Okay, I will stop here. Maybe later we have more time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially because you stick to the time. And now, Jonathan Smith, thank you very much.
It's here somewhere. Yeah, it should be. It should be here. It's a Word. It should be the Word document. And I can put your name on that. Oh yeah, no, it's okay. It's not. It's all right. It doesn't matter. No problem. I can go without it. It doesn't matter. Okay, sorry about that. Oh. Are you okay with that? I'm fine. Sorry, before I begin, I'd just like to thank the organisers of this wonderful conference, which I'm sure in years to come will be seen as to misquote, shall I say, Maurice Dobb, an epoch-making event. I mean, it seems astonishing to me, and maybe it's a sign of getting old, that it's over 30 years since the papers of Piero Sraffa were opened to access by researchers. I mean, this was a watershed moment in Sraffa scholarship. Before the papers were opened, critical assessments of Sraffa's contribution to economic thought was based on a few early articles, the introduction to his magnificent edition of Ricardo, and of course, the slim, terse volume that is Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. Once the papers were open, however, they proved to be a fertile resource for the genetic criticism of Sraffa's work, as is shown by the flowering of archive-based Sraffa scholarship published in the years following. I mean, we've already seen from Andres how important the archive is for scholarship. These same years saw advances in technology that made online digitised representations of archives possible, and eventually Sraffa's papers, like his contemporary Wittgenstein's, made their way online. I've spoken about the cataloguing of Sraffa's papers elsewhere, but today I want to touch on some of the factors that shaped their digitised version, which gives researchers worldwide access to his papers. But first, some background. When Sraffa died in 1983, his archive of personal and professional papers passed to Trinity College in Cambridge, where he'd been a fellow since 1939. The archive is substantial, documenting many aspects of his intellectual career through notes, lectures, drafts, and other preparatory works for publication. Also correspondence with fellow economists and similar materials. If this was simply the case, the materials would surely be important for the study of his contribution to economic thought. However, Sraffa's professional idiosyncrasies made them especially valuable. The late Krishna Bharadwaj was one of the few people who were allowed access to the papers in the decade after Sraffa's death. In a report for Trinity College, he makes the importance of the papers absolutely clear, and this is a long quotation, but I make no apologies because I think it's one of the most magnificent pieces of writing I've ever seen discussing the importance of archives. She says, Sraffa's idiosyncrasies as a scholar heighten the importance of his unpublished manuscripts, while at the same time they demand absolute care and application of the researcher. His short and sparse publications were distilled from a deep and sustained research which did not find public expression since he was averse to participation in formal public discussions. Much of his tireless groundwork remains hidden from public view in his manuscript notes. Their connection with his published works is of great significance for the interpretation of the latter, as well as for assessing the full implication of Sraffa's critical and constructive writings. Secondly, Sraffa was also an original thinker with a remarkable capacity for self-criticism and an untiring, ruthless pursuit of theoretical vigour. His originality is revealed in his raising questions at the fundamental level, his working out novel ideas from first principles, trenchantly criticising his own formulations, so that the notes manifest crucial turns in the ideas and reshaping his approach. His approach, formulations and conclusions. This suggests that it could even be hazardous to deal with his notes mechanically in a piecemeal or chronological fashion, and that an overview is essential. In 1993, the college decided to open the papers to the academic world at large, and it suddenly became necessary to produce a catalogue of the archive to support scholarly use of the papers, effecting an ontology which describes the papers in a hierarchical fashion. This reflects Sraffa's arrangement and provides not only context, but a structure and vocabulary with which to discuss the archive. It is also one which respects the process of its author, which is essential for the effective study of authorial papers. Over the next few years, the archive became the most popular one at Trinity, with numerous scholars visiting the RAN. Visits in person to consult the materials were necessary, as the literary executor forbade copying except to a few. Even when the catalogue was placed online, in-person visits to consult the papers were necessary. This situation persisted for a number of years. However, as the potential of the internet and associated technologies grew year on year, the zeitgeist began to influence the prevailing view in special collections libraries, as access to materials began to outweigh control over images made of them. Though I wonder if Scott had been agitating in the background, the impetus to digitise the Sraffa papers came in the form of a request in 2016 from Giancarlo De Vivo and Murray Millgate, with the backing of Lord Eatwell, now literary executor following the death of Garignani, who had received a small grant to support the work. It became evident that the simplest way forward was to make use of the now existing technology at Trinity. In the previous few years, the library had been working on what is now known as the Trinity Digital Library, whose initial purpose was to provide digitised versions of the college's 1,000 or so medieval manuscripts online. The subject called for high-quality imaging and standards-driven software, together with trained camera operators and digital editors. All had been in place for a number of years and were tried and tested, making the project to digitise the papers reasonably straightforward. Though both the software and the hardware had been upgraded since the project started, the library has always used open source software. For the technically minded, JPEG 2000 images are currently stored on a Cantaloupe image server and displayed using Universal Viewer embedded in a library webpage. That means nothing to me, but it may mean something to you. One of the challenges faced by any archival digitisation project is to present a sort of digital materiality that reflects the actual materiality of the originals as closely as possible. In the case of the Sraffa papers, the arrangement of the digitised files was governed by the catalogue produced in 1993-4, and as such the catalogue provides the most natural contextual basis for navigating the digitised files, and links to the files are embedded in the online versions of the catalogue, which are available on Trinity's archival website. As to the files themselves, we might have done a little better in crafting our digital materiality, but funds were tight. Nevertheless, digital folders were created which match the original folders by grouping together images of each page in the original folder, which could be browsed exactly like the original. However, it is also possible to link directly to individual pages with each folder, thus making more accurate referencing to items within Sraffa's papers possible. So, if you're writing an article and you want to refer to something on the digital website, you can just put a URL in which will take you directly to the page. The digitised versions are provided under a Creative Commons CC BY NC license, which allows users to share, copy and redistribute them in any medium or format, and to remix, transform and rebuild the material, as long as this is done for non-commercial processes and that appropriate credit is given. The project to digitise Sraffa's manuscripts was a simple one, but I hope one that has been reasonably effective in making them available to a much wider audience than previously was the case. However, there is another aspect to digital images that adds considerable value. In the early days of digital editions, it soon became apparent that rather than being simply copies of their analogue originals, digital images were a tool for aiding the analysis of those originals. And though some digital projects do have special functionality built in, I'm thinking here maybe of the Bergen digital edition of Wittgenstein's Nachlass, with its transcriptions marked up in XML, which allows users to search and manipulate the text in various ways. Most digital editions provide, to some extent, added value. Even in the simplest digital projects, it is possible to zoom in on areas to render illegible text legible, and also to compare images side by side, even where the originals of the two images may be in separate repositories halfway across the world. It is also possible to digitally reassemble manuscripts that have become scattered for various reasons. And as well as using the images for research purposes, they can also easily be used as evidence to corroborate that research, making it easier for the critical reader by presenting on their computer screens documents that they otherwise would probably have to travel many miles to see. In the case of Sraffa's digital edition, such basic value-added functions are enabled by the power of the software that allows extreme zooming, but also the choice of the Creative Commons license and the ability to address individual pages in the digital folder. Despite these possibilities, I've not encountered many people using the Sraffa Digital Archive in this way. One who certainly has is Scott Carter, who has produced an arrangement of the individual sheets in the production of commodities by means of commodities archives, based on the individual page rather than the folder. This reflects more accurately how the papers were produced rather than how they arrived in the library. And I expect we're going to hear more about the Tulsa arrangement from Scott himself in a few minutes. But it forms a granular basis for genetic criticism of Sraffa's most important theoretical work in true Sraffa style, i.e. from the ground up. As well as ordering and giving every sheet a Tulsa reference, there are transcripts and links to images of individual pages on Trinity's digital Sraffa. So these can be pulled up and referred to at the click of a mouse. I admired the intellectual rigor of the first wave of scholars to access the Trinity materials in the 1990s. Prolonged visits to the Wren Library at Trinity and close reading of the manuscripts produced substantial genetic criticism of Sraffa's work, with different viewpoints occasionally resulting in heated debate. The digitization of the manuscripts makes such work possible for many more scholars, wherever they are in the world, and offers different techniques for analyzing the materials. I look forward to meeting the second wave.
Thank you very much. And now we give the floor to Scott Carter.
Hi, everybody. I really appreciate you being here. Jonathan, that is just such a wonderful comment that you made, and I want to thank you for that. It's very special to me. I'm going to just jump right in here. I got a lot of slides here. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to speak about production of commodities by means of commodities, kind of give the basic foundation of that. It's going to be a little technical, but I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible. And then I'm going to move into some archival material based on the research that is done from the Tulsa arrangement, which is a cogent, chronological ordering of the papers. And it's going to be section D312 of the Sraffa papers, which is production of commodities by means of commodities. There should be a picture of production of commodities there. It's not up. In 1960, the Italian Cambridge economist Piero Sraffa published the slim, terse, and cryptic volume of less than 100 pages. It's 99 pages, okay? Production of commodities by means of commodities, subtitled Prelude to a Critique of Economic Theory. Marx, I should say, wrote Capital, a critique of political economy. And so there's always been some connection there, although not. I mean, I'm just putting it out there, FYI. In that book, Sraffa develops an alternative framework from which to develop the theory of value and distribution, kind of a micro-oriented approach to value and distribution here, or to economic theory looking at value and distribution. Key into Sraffa's framework, as Andres showed us, is the objective cost of production approach to value as opposed to the mainstream subjective approach. The basis of the framework then is in the realm of production, because production and objective cost becomes the foundation for value and distribution according to the classical model. There are two paradigms of economic thought, and this is just generally that we've been looking at. We've been talking a little bit about that the last couple of days. The first paradigm is the older paradigm, is classical political economy. That's going to base value on production time, cost of production, labor time. The second type of value and distribution begins later, and it's the marginalist theory of value and distribution, of which we now have, the mainstream economic analysis is part of that. I like to put up this brief, I call it a nonlinear sketch of the history of economic thought. You can see the schism, where do I have this thing right there? You can see the schism in 1870. 1870 is a marginalist revolution. Think Monty Python, now for something completely different, is how I tend to explain it to my students here. In the first part, you'll see the classical theory of value, production base, a theory of value. In the latter, you're going to see the neoclassical, but here, modern heterodox approaches, you can see where I lead with Sraffa coming out of the classical tradition into a modern approach to classical political economy. So this is where we get a little bit technical here, okay? So in this framework, Sraffa develops two simple models. It's a two-commodity model each, okay? The first one is called production for subsistence, okay? In production for subsistence, the inputs will exactly equal to the output. So you see here, you've got inputs to production are going to be the following. So you have two different industries. You have the wheat industry and the iron industry. The wheat industry uses wheat as means of production and iron as means of production, and so too for the iron industry in these particular amounts. Okay, and then this is going to be the output to production. So you'll see here, I draw. And it's called a transactions table. You'll see here all of the industries. It's going to be the wheat industry, the iron industry. This is going to be the total. What you're looking at here is the gross output. Now, you cannot add 280 and 12 to get 400. This is a production process. Just like in this particular device, it takes plastic, it takes metal, it takes all sorts of stuff to make this. This is an integrated production process, vertical integration into the production process. This started around the early 1920s, 1930s. Sraffa, we know from his notes, was one of the first ones to establish this. And so you can see here, you're going to be looking here, this is going to be the sum of wheat used in the economy as a whole, the sum of iron used in the economy as a whole, which is going to be equal to the output, to the gross output. There is no net output in the surplus case. So what this does is it brings to fore, and Andres talked about this at the beginning when he did the B1 equal to A2. It's a balance condition, which for those who know Marx can also have some resonance in volume 2 of the schemes of reproduction. So you'll see here that in order for exchange between these two different industries to be effectuated, the iron industry needs wheat and the wheat industry needs iron. Ergo, there has to be an exchange process. And this exchange process, Sraffa shows us, is most simply understood when we're looking at what he calls a subsistence economy. No other economist has a subsistence economy. This is not Adam Smith's early and rude state. This is not Marx's simple reproduction, because both of those contain a net product. This is void of net product all the way. So there is no net product. So you have your means of production there. You can see the wheat for the wheat, the iron for the wheat for the iron for the iron. They're inputs, and then you're going to have the outputs. You're going to have inputs are going to exchange. I refer to an own exchange of the inputs. So there's going to be exchange of wheat commodity for the wheat industry. That's going to be the seed. Iron commodity for the iron industry. That's going to be the input of iron. Sraffa in the 1920s refers to this as seed. He says interest on fixed capital, interest on seed. Now, he's going to develop this in some detail in other ways, but at this stage, he's recognizing what I refer to as the own exchange, wheat for wheat, versus the cross exchange, iron for wheat. So you have the wheat, the own exchange, and then you have the cross exchange. All right, and so that then becomes the basis of the exchange. We see then you have the change in inputs. You have the cross exchange of the inputs to the industry. And so here, I'll just read here. There's a unique set, this is from Sraffa, Production of Commodities. There's a unique set of exchange values which, if adopted by the market, restores the original distribution of the products and make it possible for the process to be repeated. That's the idea, social reproduction. What are the conditions that allow for the society to reproduce itself? Such values spring directly from the methods of production and productive consumption. Particularly in this example, we see that it's 10 quarters of wheat for 1 ton of iron. And you can see the X1 is quarters of wheat, the X2 is tons of iron. So X1 is wheat, X2 is iron. I try to make this simple as possible. Right? And so you can see here, you're going to have different exchange value. If 120 units quarters of corn is equal to 12 tons of iron, you can either have 10 quarters of corn equal to 1 ton of iron, or 1 quarter of corn equal to 1/10 ton of iron. So you can see you have the same relation there. And so this then gives you the different exchange relations. Now this is the form of price that Sraffa uses in production of commodities. It's strictly speaking what I would call exchange value. That's different from what we would call the price form, where the price form has a particular numeraire that's going to be the measure of value across it. So they're going to be related, but Sraffa specifically looks at this particular exchange value, and sussing this out has been one of the interesting aspects of this project. So you can see here, if you do consider a numeraire, and I apologize for those, I know I have a lot of time. I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to be too technical. That said, the numeraire can be chosen. Either you can express your numeraire in terms of tons of iron, or you can express your numeraire in terms of quarters of wheat. It's just the unit of account. And so you have 2 different sets of prices depending on which numeraire you choose. And so what I have put here is this. Okay, just real quick. This is going to be the exchange value: 1 quarter of wheat, 1/10 ton of iron, 10 quarters of wheat, 1 ton of iron. These are going to be the numeraire. When wheat's the numeraire, the price is equal to 1. When wheat's the numeraire, the cross price of iron is equal to 10 quarters per ton. All right, you can see that from that exchange relation there. And so too when you're looking at the local iron configuration. So when iron is a numeraire, the iron price of wheat is 1/10 ton per quarter. The iron price of iron is, of course, 1. 1 unit pure number, because 1 unit of iron exchanges for itself, 1 unit of wheat exchanges for itself. Okay? And then you're going to have what I call the input-output tables. What you do is you take your physical structure production. You'll see the 280 quarters of wheat, the 120 quarters of wheat, the 12 tons of iron, the 8 tons of iron, multiplied by the respective prices. This is going to be the wheat price. All right, so wheat multiplied by itself, of course, is equal to quarters. The wheat price of iron is going to be so many tons per quarter. So then you can see everything is going to be commensurate. The input of wheat for the wheat industry is 280 quarters. The input of iron for the wheat industry is now 120 quarters. And so too for the iron industry, you can commensurate the entire system depending on the numeraire. Thank you very much. Okay, and so then you're going to have this for iron. Iron is a numeraire. Now we move, and this is, don't worry about that, but that's just a linear algebra depiction of that subsistence economy. Then we go to production with a surplus. All right, now the only thing that differs from Sraffa and production with a surplus is this. Everything else is the same. The only thing he changes is going to be that. Okay, and so when we go through, we're going to see, you can see now that the output is going to be greater than the input for the wheat industry only. This now has a net output. You can see that net output is going to consist of 175 quarters of wheat and now 0 tons of iron. We would say that the iron industry does not produce anything extra. It's only going to be the wheat industry. That said, we move to the position here. Now when there's a surplus, the mathematics of it all change. You do not have that simple reproduction that you had previously where wheat and iron cross inputs are going to be exchanged. You're going to have that process, but there's also 175 quarters of wheat as surplus that needs to be distributed to the owners of the different industries according to the generated profit. And so how do we arrive at this generated profit? Sraffa reduces it in terms of here. Wait, I don't want to go to this one yet. Okay, this here. So he says we increase the iron to 575, leaving 175 quarters of wheat. The exchange ratio, which enables the advances to replace, is now going to be 15 quarters of wheat for 1 ton of iron, and the corresponding rate of profit is 25%. Now, Sraffa does not tell us how he got that 25%, and I spent decades trying to figure out what that is, okay? And so, or at least years, I should say, trying to figure out what that is. And we know this from start to get technical, from the Piero-Frobenius theorems of non-negative square matrices, where if you were to ascertain the maximum eigenvalue of this particular matrix of inter-industry coefficients, you can arrive at the characteristic vector here, and then as such, you can arrive at the characteristic equation, which is here, and you can arrive at the maximum eigenvalue, which is here, which then takes you here as you go through it, and boom, there's your 25%. So it's a technical relation. Sraffa did not know the Piero-Frobenius theorems, okay? He developed this in terms of, I got 2 minutes, okay? I haven't even got to the Tulsa arrangement, so I got to get going on this, okay? Because what I want to show you is that he arrived at this, okay, in his notes in spring of 1928. Let me try to show you what I'm talking about. So this is going to be it. You have the different, you see the exchange ratio. There's going to be your 25% rate of profit. These are going to be the exchange values. These are going to be the prices. And then we're going to have here, that's our thing, and then we're going to the Tulsa arrangement. So let me go here. Okay, we're going to be doing this one. This is we're actually going to do D3. So Jonathan put the entire archive into these 10 different sections. This is the section I use, and I look at the publication section here. You can see it's going to be here. This is the publication section. It's got 115 files. Okay, we've arranged the first 102. Okay, Usha Pradhan, who is here, helped me 10 years ago as a graduate student at UMKC, and together we put together the prototype of this arrangement. So I break it down into 3 different periods here. What we have, you can't see that. This then becomes a Tulsa arrangement. I'm running out of time, so I don't want to go too crazy. But this is going to be the Ren Trinity and the Bargerois-Garigliani archival arrangement, the Ren Trinity catalog, the Bargerois-Garigliani inventory, and this is what I've done. All right, and I'll explain more about that in maybe in the questions. This is going to be the chronological order that this takes, so I've been able to put this in chronological order. Sraffa started teaching the advanced theory, the lectures on the advanced theory of value in fall of 1928, and you can see that most of the material in that period comes from before he had his thing. Okay, I'm leaving, okay? This is going to be the chronology that we had here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it to here. All right, so we're going to go here. We're going to be looking at the solution to the system in November of 1927. We know that Sraffa was able to solve for his system. These are these exchange values. Okay, 1A is equal to 67, 63rd C. You're looking at that exchange value relation, not the numeraire relation. Just give me 1 minute here. This is going to be one that he writes in February of 1955. So this idea that Sraffa was just in 1927 being very rudimentary, but he advanced beyond it is not true, because in 1955, when he went to the island of Mallorca, he reproduced exactly the same analysis there. I want you to look at this one here. You can see that the values are 1A to 3B, 1B to 2/3 C, 1C to 1/2 A, and then when you do the exchange, you see here 1A to 3C, 3B, 1B to 2/3 C, and then 1C to 1/2 A. All right, so you can see that Sraffa solved it. Okay, I'm almost done here. And then he could not solve the surplus system. Okay, the equations are contradictory, so no solution exists. I will not try the Italian. I was practicing my Italian this morning, but I'm not going to do that. So he didn't find a solution. This is in November of 1927. Cut to the chase here. Okay, he does come up with a solution here. There's a subsistence system. I don't know why this is not up here. I don't have these pictures here. All right, anyway, what I want to show you is this. All right, and I'm done. This is going to be the system that he's going to be developing in 1928. This is going to be going through the particular situation. We arrive at that as the inverse of the maximum eigenvalue. And what I want to show you is that Sraffa solves it. Where's it at? Right here. Where's that thing at here? Where did I see it? Didn't I see it? This thing, I'm so sorry. I'm not getting my pages there. All right. He solved it. Where is it at? Here. Here's this. All right, so he does solve for the value, and then he also solves for the for the eigenvalue. So I really wish I was able to show that. It's right here. This eigenvalue he shows also in 1928. And so with that, let me say here, yes, that's the end. I know it was long, but it was quick. But thank you very much. I want to respect the time. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Okay.
and easy. Okay, thank you very much, Scott. And now we go, sorry, because I can't see anymore. Saverio Fratini, thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. Thank you, Scott.
It should be on this, on that one. Yeah, it's already open. Yeah.
But my screen is different.
Let me help you here. There was a problem here yesterday. I figured out how to solve, which is...
The clock is running.
Not for me.
So some things make it good. Yeah.
I uploaded, but it didn't work.
All right, some things make it good. No, this happened yesterday, and we were able to do the job.
Let's just end the show.
There you have it.
Okay. So thank you again. Oops. I don't know why there isn't a first slide, but anyway, no problem. Actually, my presentation is a sort of long introduction on topics that are perhaps probably already known. There is, however, a final slide in which I will talk about new path to be undertaken, new research path. I will start with a very brief reconstruction, historical reconstruction of what Sraffa did in the late 1920s. As is well known, on May 1927, Sraffa was appointed lecturer in economics by the Faculty of Economics of Cambridge University, and in July 1927 he moved to England. And during the summer 1927, Sraffa began preparing his lecture, and we know that during this period a turning point occurred on Sraffa's interpretation of the classical economists and on Sraffa's interpretation of Marshall theory of prices. As a result, on October 1927, Sraffa's lectures were postponed, and they eventually started in October 1928. From Sraffa's pocket diary, we know that he met Keynes on November 26, 1927, and Keynes approved the first questions. The first question, as Scott said a few minutes ago, the equation determining relative prices for an economy without surplus. And 2 days later, Keynes wrote to his wife, saying that Sraffa is in so much intellectual ferment and excitement about his ideas, since I said that I thought there was something in them, that he walks very fast up and down his room all day thinking about them. It is impossible for him to write them down, because as soon as he thinks about them, he has to start walking again. Actually, this presentation focuses on what Sraffa discovered in that period and on the way in which this discovery affected Sraffa's work till production of commodities by means of commodities. Okay, so in the fall and the winter 1927 and 1928, Sraffa discovered that there was a degeneration of the notion of cost, for the initial notion of the physiocrats to the modern notion. In fact, according to Adam Smith, in order to put industry into motion, three things are requisite: materials to work upon, tools to work with, and the wages or recompense for the sake of which the work is done. And a similar idea can be found in James Mill. James Mill wrote that the agents of production are the commodities themselves. They are the food of the laborer, the tools and the machinery which he works, and the raw material which he works upon. This means that commodities are produced by means of commodities, and this is the idea of a circular process of production, in contrast with the one-way avenue from the factors of production to consumption goods that we can find in the modern approach. And this is the idea of the physical cost, namely the cost of production in terms of the commodities that enable the production process. Nonetheless, at the same time, since labor was understood as the engine of the production process was actually a process of labor, the employment of commodities was considered as approximately proportional to the employment of labor. Hence, labor was understood as a possible measure, not a possible source, but a possible measure of the cost of production of commodities, so that their relative prices were approximately determined by the relative quantities of labor they embody. However, labor was also understood by Adam Smith as a sacrifice, as toil and trouble. But then, according to the vulgar economists, capital accumulation was also regarded as a sacrifice, since capital accumulation involves abstinence from consumption. Hence, Marshall said that the real cost is a sum of measurable efforts and sacrifices. Finally, there was the idea of the cost as inducement. Since labor and waiting involve sacrifices, something must be given to workers and capitalists in order to induce them to take part in the production process. According to Sraffa, this was the last step in the wrong direction. And this is a well-known document from Sraffa's archive, in which Sraffa described the evolution of the concept of cost. According to Sraffa, it was only Petty and the physiocrats who had the right notion of cost as the loaf of bread, the subsistence for the workers. Then somebody started measuring it in labor, as every day's labor requires the same amount of food. Then they proceeded to regard cost as actually an amount of labor. Then Adam Smith interpreted labor as the toil and trouble, which is the real cost and the hardship. Then this was by Ricardo brought back to labor, but not far back enough. And Marx went only as back as Ricardo. Then Senior invented abstinence, and Keynes unified all the cost, work, abstinence, and risk as sacrifice. Now, Davenport, Castle, and Anderson, which are the fathers of the idea of cost as inducement, have carried it a step further, the last step in the wrong direction. So, according to Sraffa, the right notion of cost is the physical cost, the set of commodities that are necessary to enable the production process. Since the production process cannot take place without the employment of the commodities that form the real cost, they must be there when the process begins. They are observable and measurable. No tricks can be played. Here we have a nice example provided by Sraffa about the difference between the physical cost and the cost as inducement. In Sraffa's example, carrots are necessary if we want a donkey to work. But there are two sorts of carrots: those which we must have given to it before in order to enable it to work, otherwise it would be dead, and those you must show to it and promise to it in order to induce it to work. There is a great difference between the two. The first is a definite number or weight of real carrots determined by physiological conditions, and since they have been actually consumed, it has been possible to weigh them and to know exactly to the ounce their quantity. No tricks can be played about them. The others are different. They needn't even be real carrots. It may be a meshed paper carrot rubbered against real carrots to take up the smell, which we simply show to the donkey, or it may be a stick, or it may be that at the end of its working day, we fulfill, at the end of the working day, we fulfill our promise and give it its evening ration of carrots. But I suggest that we don't do this because we are honest or because we don't want to damage our credit with the donkey, but simply because we want to enable it to work tomorrow. Now, economics deals with meshed paper carrots and whips. Political economy dealt with real carrots. So it is now widely recognized that Sraffa initially wrote his equations as an attempt to refer commodity prices to the physical quantities of commodities necessary for their production. The problem was to single out the necessary commodity. With the aim of focusing the attention of the necessary commodities, Sraffa tried to set aside every possible substitutability between commodities by means of specific assumptions. Wages are assumed to be at the subsistence level, there aren't alternative methods of production, and there is no surplus. Referring to a no surplus system, Sraffa wrote the conditions of production, namely the methods of production. Here we have on the left-hand side, the uppercase letters are produced quantities, gross outputs, and the lowercase letters are inputs, quantities of commodities that are employed as means of production in the different sectors. Again, the system is a no surplus system since the produced quantity is exactly equal to the sum of the quantities of these commodities that are employed as means of production. According to Sraffa, these are homogeneous linear equations. They have infinite sets of solutions, but the solutions of each set are proportional. These proportions are univoque, which means unique, univocally determined. These proportions we call ratios of absolute values, namely relative prices. They are purely numerical relations between things, A, B, and so on and so forth. Actually, these are not equations, as you can see, as there are no unknowns, but only given quantities. Both the produced quantities and the quantities of commodities that are employed as inputs are given quantities. Nonetheless, Sraffa is right. These quantities allow the determination of relative prices. Here there is an overlap with Scott's presentation, and actually, the above is not a system of equations, as I already said, but rather a set of methods of production. Replacing the sign of equality with an arrow gives a system of conditions of production equivalent to those found in the opening sections of production of commodities. This is exactly the same system of methods of production discussed by Scott, but my explanation is much simpler. Because here we have a system without surplus, so the system is in a self-replacing state. We are producing exactly the same quantities that we are employing. Nonetheless, if the production process has to be repeated, exchange is needed. It is needed in order to restore the initial distribution of commodities between the two sectors. As a result, 120 quarters of wheat must be traded for 12 tons of iron, determining an exchange ratio of 10 quarters of wheat for 1 ton of iron. Sraffa's conclusion is that such values spring directly from the methods of production. The same idea is in a well-known document in which Sraffa writes that the significance of the equations is simply this, that if a man fell from the moon on the earth and noted the amount of things consumed in each factory and the amount produced by each factory during a year, he could deduce the he could deduce at which values the commodities must be sold. In short, the equations show that the conditions of exchange are entirely determined by the condition of production. And this is my final slide, in which there are some new paths to be undertaken about the study of Sraffa's paper of 1920s. Once it is established that for the economy without surplus, it is possible to determine prices on the basis of production methods alone, two routes open up in Sraffa's research work of the late 1920s. The first route is to introduce surplus, to introduce profit into the equations. Looking at the manuscripts, we can distinguish several attempts. The first is to include profit within the physical cost. Capitalists can be considered as the parasites that eat the harvest. The commodities used to save the crop from the parasites are surely part of the cost. And this attempt, however, was soon abandoned by Sraffa. A second way is to assume that the surplus consists entirely of one commodity, silk. And this is the way in which Sraffa introduces non-basic commodities within his analysis. A further attempt is to start from a system without surplus and assume an increase in the output of all commodities by the same percentage. Interestingly enough, in this way, what is obtained is a standard system. Finally, from the proportional surplus, Sraffa arrives at the proportional profit, the uniform rate of profit. The second route is to develop the idea of physical cost as wages advanced, but advanced for different periods. This ties in with the conception of capital that Sraffa attributes to Keynes and calls Keynes T, or Keynes T square. Along this path, we find some anticipation of Sraffa's idea of the reduction of commodity prices to dated quantities of labor. On this subject, there is a long paper in Italian, entirely in Notepad, written in the summer of 1929 in Rapallo, which in other papers Sraffa calls the Rapallo paper. So, Sraffa's manuscripts of the late 1920s still contain many topics to be explained in depth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now it's the turn of Alex Thomas. I didn't see him. Thanks.
When I do the Scott? No, all the images are not showing. So can I have
okay,
the
PDF. Yeah, PDF. This is the PDF. It should be I should be on this one. Wait a minute. We have to return to the old and forgotten method of the. Where is this one? There. Yes.
What do you need, Scott?
Toshiba. It's a Toshiba.
Physical slide.
The PowerPoints aren't showing the images. Yeah, so we're going to do this real quick. He gave me a PDF. We got this right here. Okay, it's going to be at the Chain Conference. Okay, it's going to be other, and then it should be one of yours there. Is that right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, get what you need. Okay.
I think it's the second one, right? That's still PowerPoint.
You should have. Yeah. That's PowerPoint. Oh.
Yeah. Sorry.
All right.
I think I need the
he told me-
images.
told me
There's
the
too many images there.
Shit. Okay.
Are the images working on the
No, not
PowerPoint?
on the PowerPoint. You can't look at them. Oh, sorry.
We can open the PowerPoint and save the PDF.
Okay, no,
That's right.
Yeah, we can try that. But I think I put so much time on the images that.
That's the correct presentation.
Yeah, that's right. Just see, I think the images are not showing up. The images are not showing up. Okay.
The images are showing.
Okay, great.
Let's see if when we put here.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Jisoo, for all the help. So I've actually traveled 20 hours to come here, and when I saw the audience, I thought about what I'm going to talk about. And one is, do I want to talk to my panelists and the other people who know about Sraffa, or the audience which does not know much about Sraffa? And I decided I'm going to disappoint both groups maybe, and try and pitch it at the middle. So I don't know if I'm going to be successful, but I'll give it a try. So I'm going to talk about Sraffa, Edwin Cannon, and the history of economic thought. And I'm glad that already some context has been set. And the contents of my presentation is going to be the following. I'm going to give a little bit of introduction, say something about the existing literature, the link between Sraffa and Cannon, their standpoints on history of economic thought, their contributions to history of economic thought, and some conclusion. So in terms of introduction, I think, again, this quotation here is quite well known to people who have looked at the Sraffa papers, but essentially this is what I want to focus on. So if you read this book referring to, on the right, you have in Sraffa's handwriting, he's talking about the theories of production and distribution by Cannon, and also on the side he mentions his other book, Review of Economic Theory. You should be critical towards Cannon because of the attitude that he has towards classical economists. And as we know, and as has been shown in the other presentations too, Sraffa sees scientific merit in the work of classical economists. Now, how does one make sense of history of economic thought when we have two kind of contending approaches to even doing history of economic thought? And because I teach history of economic thought, and I'm also working on a textbook on history of economic thought, this was another motivation to actually engage with this material. And because I don't have any numbers, like some of my colleagues, I thought, let me make it a little colorful, and so I actually have some color in the slides. So this is to give a biographical context of what I'm talking about. Marshall's Principles of Economics, 1890, important. Then we see History of Theories published in 1893, Review of Economic Theory, 1929. He gives lectures in LSE for a long period, which is Cannon, right? And he also edits Adam Smith's lectures on justice or jurisprudence, and also the Wealth of Nations. Then we come to Sraffa, where the context of Cannon and Marshall is there, the important 1926 article, the Cambridge Lectures, and then he's also the editor of the Works and Correspondence of Ricardo, and then in 1960, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. So Marshall, again, is important for both parties, right, because Marshall is suggesting a kind of continuity thesis. Essentially, that Jevons is an advance over Ricardo, and later one would think that Marshall is an advance, or Marshall synthesizing the ideas of Jevons and of Ricardo in the supply and demand apparatus. But the question about Marshall's influence in Marshall's influence in Cambridge is that if you look at the work of Nerio Naldi, who is a biographer and worked on biography of Sraffa, is that the distinction that there exists something very radically different between classical economics and marginalist economics could not be taken for granted in the early 1920s. Right? And because the Marshallian school denied such a difference. But if you look at Cannon, 1894, there is a distinction that he makes between abstract theory and historical school, referring to the German historical school. And for people who are familiar with Veblen, you would also see that kind of difference in the work of Veblen. But in Marx, in Theories of Surplus Value, and in Capital Volume 1, Marx is already making a distinction between vulgar economists and political economists, as already been mentioned yesterday. So one needs to also understand how maybe Sraffa is engaging with these kinds of distinctions. And actually, so Edwin Kennan sends his books to, this is just to show the correspondence between Marshall and Kennan. He sends his books to Marshall, and Marshall is actually quite happy with them. And this I've taken from this correspondence of Alfred Marshall. So here you can see that Marshall is quite happy with Kennan's lectures, although he writes here that he did not know so much about some of the French economists like Mirabeau and all that. Now, when I was looking at the literature which I wanted to engage with, there is some material on Kennan, of course, and there's much more material on Sraffa as well. And here I also want to mention the work of Scott here, because I think for a long time I've looked at the work of Smith, Ricardo, and mainly classical economists, but it's only, I think, with the digitization project that people like me who are sitting in India could actually easily access the material. So I think that has been really fantastic, and I hope that many people who did not have access earlier will have access. In terms of the similarities between Sraffa and Kennan, certainly the influence of Marshall, as I've already noted, but also the interest in, again, I looked today morning, I asked Google to tell me how to pronounce Saint-Simon in French, but I don't know whether I have to say Saint-Simon, but anyway, Saint-Simon. And actually, Kennan writes a book which called The Duke of Saint-Simon, but then I figured out that actually it's not the same person as who Sraffa works on, which is, and this, looking at Sraffa papers, which is Henry de Saint-Simon. But the interesting thing is actually they're both related, right? So the person who worked on, the Kennan's Saint-Simon and Sraffa's Saint-Simon, and there's also a connection with Christian socialism there. And Sraffa also attended some of Kennan's lectures in London School of Economics when he was a research student for 3 months. Although I was not sure whether it's 1921 or 1922. I wanted to clarify that. And Potier, for instance, writes that Sraffa was influenced at that stage by the teachings of Kennan. And we also know that Sraffa, while he was working on the Ricardo material, did consult many people, including Keynes, but also Kennan. And Morris Dobb, who collaborated with Sraffa on the project of the Ricardo edition, also has a connection with Kennan, which is that when he did his doctoral thesis on the theory of capitalist enterprise, the book is shown there. But in the acknowledgements to the book, he actually writes that Kennan provided invaluable criticism, but in 1978, when I looked at his more autobiographical writing, he writes that the supervision of Kennan was nominal. This also means that how one studies what people are writing, I don't know, there's some sort of a inconsistency there. Now, Sraffa, of course, read Kennan, as we know from the first slide that I showed. And so when I looked at the catalog of the library of Piero Sraffa, which is put together by De Vivo, it is clear that Sraffa had 2 copies of Kennan 1893. And in this catalog, we also get to know whether there are annotations in these books that Sraffa had or not. So in the Review of Economic Theory, there are no annotations as per De Vivo, but there are annotations in a history of theories. And so there is, as I mentioned, there's also not just attending lectures, but there's also correspondence between Sraffa and Kennan. And I want to talk a little bit about this passage right here, which is Kennan to Sraffa, because when Sraffa later publishes the correspondence, actually the letter before this is that Sraffa asked Kennan, how to go about publishing the correspondence. Should he publish it in the order of themes, or should he publish it in a chronological order? And what Kennan writes here is clearly that if you were in Gatcombe Park and you were receiving letters every day from different people, he wanted readers also to have that experience. Right? So, and this is what he later writes in the introduction. And so there was clearly a lot of, not a lot, but significant correspondence about how actually the book of Ricardo, that is Principles, was printed, reprinted, what was the cost of the book, along with how the correspondence had to be published. In terms of Kanan's history of economic thought standpoint, which I think is important because I don't think it's the same as Sraffa's. And here, what Kanan writes is that the old theories have been replaced by others stronger from a scientific point of view. Right? And actually, in the second edition to his book, he adds 2 sections to his final chapter. And the chapter is titled Politics and Economics. And the title of the section is, again, Unsatisfactory Character of the Theories of Production and Distribution, regarded from a purely scientific point of view. And what he means by this is certainly that by the older theories, he's referring to the economics of Smith, Ricardo, and others. Right? And when you look at Sraffa's history of economic thought standpoint, and has been made clear by my co-panelists as well. In Sraffa 1926 famous article, you find a critique of Marshall and Marshallian economics. Then he started giving the lectures on advanced theory of value at Cambridge. And here there is a little bit of debate between people who are working on the Sraffa papers. So one is that, as I showed the quote in the beginning, the influence of Marshallian economics. Right? So, for instance, Lazzarini, based on Gariani's work, writes that, and I think this was also just shown earlier, it was based on the work of Kanan, who is talking about old theories and new theories. And Gariani deduces this from Sraffa's 1926 article, where he writes the old and now obsolete theory to the work of classical economists. But De Vivo, on the other hand, writes that it's not just Kanan's work, but also theories of surplus value, which Sraffa was familiar with. So then, how do you understand Sraffa's own position about whether there were differences in these approaches at that time? So I'm leaving it as an open question here. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Kanan and Sraffa are there. And by 1960, there's a constructive critique, and I'm using the word critique intentionally here, of classical political economy, and a devastating critique of marginalist economics. Right? And if you actually look at the kind of writing that is there in the new and old theories, it is, for instance, Kanan's writing about old and new finds a kind of mention, I would think, a similar point in Sraffa's writing as well, which was just shown by Saverio before. Now, in terms of Kanan's contributions to history of economic thought, it was certainly that, what he's saying here is that earlier people did not provide quotations or textual evidence. People just said whatever they wanted to say. Right? And what he tries to do in his work is to actually mention, give proper quotations. And so there are other strong, contributions that have been listed. And I think that this I just want to mention one thing here, because some have already been mentioned. I'm just going to take 1 minute more, because I feel maybe traveling all the way from India, 20 hours, I get less time than that, but which is the point about exogenous distribution. And because there are people who are activists and organizers, this inverse relationship between prices and quantities, seen as this very simple form, I think suggests a particular political standpoint which is not in favor of workers. And similarly, the inverse relationship between real wages and quantity of labor also suggests a particular political standpoint, both of them which Sraffa rejects. Right? And the editorship of both Kanan and Sraffa, as Einaudi writes, Sraffa emulates Kanan and overrides him. And I would urge people to actually read the collected works put together by Sraffa and Daub. And finally, this is the last slide. I think that it's very clear that Kanan has a cumulative view of intellectual progress, and I think that needs to be rejected. Sraffa clearly shows the intellectual rupture in 1870s. And finally, I want to end with this point. Because ideas matter, today it's very difficult to do a PhD in, let's say, bringing together a critical edition. It's very difficult to do a PhD or write a thesis on a biography. There was a point of time when that was possible, and I hope that the center here in Tulsa will be able to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that since it's a bit late, we open immediately the discussion to the audience, and I will start by asking one question to all the panelists, probably also interesting the people that are not so specialistics. So the point is, if you have to say in one sentence the reason why Sraffa and political economy is important and relevant today, and also the reason why it is important and relevant for left-wing or heterodox activism or militancy. Thank you very much. But I think I'll collect other questions at the same time, and then I'll try to collect the other question. I don't have the microphone. Okay.
Bring one around. Thanks. You want? I take the first one.
No.
Yeah, Mattias Ronengo, Bucknell University. So I'm glad of that we're talking about Sraffa. I think that for the conference it would be the sort of underlying thing. I think one of you, I think Scott said something about Sraffa's relation with Marx. When I was hired at the University of Utah, A.K. Hunt, well-known Marxist author, asked me whether I was a Marxist, and my reply was, I'm a Sraffian. I think Sraffa thought of himself as a Marxist. What didn't emerge on here, and maybe it's my reading, and I'm a dilettante I'm a macroeconomist, so I do read a lot of this, but I don't know enough. But Giancarlo De Vivo's book on Nella bufera del Novecento, he does say that it's the reading of the French edition, so it's there in the catalog of his books, of Marx's theories of surplus value, that is the catalyst for that change around 27 that Saverio was talking about. I know that not everybody agrees with that, and it's my understanding, so to me it seems very convincing. I'm really happy to hear what's your view on that.
Thank you very much. I just had a question about if you could explain to all of us what is the substance of the critique of political economy and economics, especially the critique to marginalism that Sraffa brings to the table, and how this is associated with the critique of the limits of what is sayable in mathematical terms, which I think is probably part of what is interesting for all of us here in a larger sense. Thank you.
First of all, it's nice to see some old friends from Cambridge, and as you see, Sraffa may create passions on very abstract things. I think we all have to say thanks to Jonathan Smith. I was there since, I think, 95, 96, and most of the things we are working is due to him, as well as to Scott, because he was a great part in making the whole archive public. I would like to say three very quick things. One is to connect the sessions. In the sessions on Marx yesterday, the punker talked about the falling rate of profit. If I understood well, he said that the rate of profit to be falling, there is the need of a certain dynamics going up of the real wage. Well, this is exactly the defense of the tendential rate of profit to fall that we find in 42, 43, in a notebook against Borchievics, in which Marx was really going for the defense of the theory of value and the theory of the rate of profit in his own way. Second point, it is very interesting that in that notebook, there is the only time, for me, there may be other instances, in which Sraffa used the expression, 42-43, production of commodities by means of commodities. It's a very strange expression. But he didn't stop there. He said, Borchewitz must be criticized. It's not easy, it's a bit vague, but the real critique, the real criticism is that capitalism is production of commodities by means of commodities through labor. That is the third point. As you see, we are here, have papers mostly excited about Sraffa, but for some reason, Sraffa scholars tend to study the Sraffa mostly, and not only, of 27, 30, 31, which is the most physicalist Sraffa, to be flat, the most Stidmanian Sraffa. Sraffa changed it. Sraffa in 40, let me joke, he became almost also on Marx and Orthodox value theory Marxist. Then he changed this idea, but he never came back to the usual criticism. He never criticized, by the way, the transformation problem, wrongly, I think, but that was the thing. And so the real point is to understand the development of Sraffa going onwards, in my view, going beyond a too physicalist approach. Last point, which relates to the question of Giovanna Vertova and of Clara Mattei, actually, we try to understand the world to change it. But we can't change the world without understanding it. What was the legacy or the intellectual project of Piero Sraffa? Claudio Napoleoni in 1988, in January, at Bocconi, a few months before dying, had a very, very good, in my view, expression. He said, you know, Sraffa had an intellectual project. An intellectual project is always theoretical and political. And this political project was this. Sraffa was, first of all, a communist. And for communists, it must be meant in a negative sense. That is, the critique of the real process in action. But he was convinced that the old critique was insufficient, not because it was wrong, but because there were other things to confront, theoretically and politically. I think that is the thing. So we are in an open discussion of what from Sraffa one can take. Somebody could say the wage as independent variable. I would say the idea that capital is the totality that tries to englobe everything else, and that democracy is there if you break this attempt to totalitariization.
Hi, I'm Talas Syed at UC Berkeley, and I apologize. I was not here yesterday, so if this came up in the Marx discussion, I apologize for repeating anything. But I just want to basically follow up, I think, on all three comments, and especially Clara's remark about what critique and the limits of math are and connected with Professor Bellafiore. So I just want to offer as a provocation that the Marx that features so far in this discussion in the relation to Sraffa is the Marx of a critical political economy that sort of extends and refines the classical political economy tradition. But of course, now there's a kind of worldwide attempt at introducing a different Marx, which is the critique of political economy, not critical political economy. And even in the first wave of the Sraffa debate with Marx, Bob Rowthorne and others made this point that, you know, the neo-Ricardians understand Marx himself as a neo-Ricardian, and that's a critical political economy approach, not a critique of political economy. And what is the difference? Well, the difference is, of course, that by critique, Marx in capital, not Sraffa in production of commodities by means of commodities, means to underline the historical preconditions of the possibility of the critique, right? It's a Kantian critique to underline the historically specific social relations that classical political economy presuppose, naturalize, and eternalize in their objectivist, surplus-based, labor-based categories, by showing that, in fact, It's not about that so much as, so I'll put it very simply. Neoclassical marginalism, classical political economy, and Sraffa's blistering critique of both and his return to a more objectivist materialist critique are all theories of value as content. Different sources, subjective, labor, objective. But of course, the critique of political economy is not that. It is not a theory of value as content. It is a theory of the content of human needs and powers taking the form of value, right? It's a value form critique. It's a fundamental problem shift. So just as neoclassical economics in the 1870s, marginalism is a problem shift from growth and distribution to efficiency and allocation, and we can understand Sraffa as returning to the original problem shift, Marx's critique is a problem shift away from classical political economy as well. It's not an inquiry into growth and distribution and the content of value in either labor or objective factors and how they're distributed in some mathematical way. No, it's a critique of the social relations of capital, of ceaseless accumulation of exchange value, enveloping human needs and powers, and subjecting everything to this remorseless, as Ricardo put it, totalizing logic. And that's an extremely different idea. And to borrow Clara's point, it's not a quantitative but a qualitative. It's about the limits of math because of course, and now we draw on Son Rathel and all this tradition, the entire idea of commiserating these different things is itself not something that's done in the thought of human economists, but it's done in the practice of market participants. The real abstraction that subjects everything to quantified monetized value is itself the subject of Marxist critique. And I'd be very interested, because of course Sraffa's argument is a brilliant destruction of the premises and problematiques of neoclassical and to some extent classical. But it still remains within the paradigm that I would say Marx's critique is trying to put into critical relief.
Thank you. Nikos Kazarakis from the New School. I think we're all pretty much on the same page, so I'll try to be quick, but at the same time I'll try to go against the current, kind of defending Sraffa against all this. What we all converge in some sense is something that has been noted by two Marxists, and that's pretty well known, I'd say. At least the first one was Mandel, in the prologue of Karl Marx's economic writings, something like that, saying it's great that someone goes back to this subjective labor theory of value, even though he doesn't do it in the correct way. He goes to Ricardo, not to Marx. And the second one, and this is probably more important, is Okishio, which was in Japanese and recently translated, I guess you know it, saying, well, that's just someone post-Portkiewichian, nothing much. To me, though, that brings into mind Foucault, who says, well, Marx is just a minor post-Ricardian. So what's the difference from seeing Marx as a minor post-Ricardian, which probably can be reflected in what's the difference from seeing Sraffa as a minor post-Portkiewichian? I'd say the difference lies, first of all, exactly in realizing that there are social conditions behind all this. But what I always felt that was incomplete in Sraffa was this, and something that actually Okishio pinned down even to himself. There are processes behind what we see there. Sraffa never explained, Scott, it was nice to see this calculation of how Sraffa got the eigenvalue, but there's no process to get the eigenvalue. Morissima has a process. You may say, okay, it's Walrasian, it's Markov, nothing. But there's a process there. Sraffa went all the way to almost reconstruct a general equilibrium theory that is not Walrasian per se, but stopped. And I'd like to hear why, in relation to why or how he is different from a Marxist attempt to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that we are done with the question, otherwise they don't have time to answer. So do you want to go in the reverse order or whatever? So you're not going to say anything? Okay. You can have a bit of his time.
Sorry, I'll get this over with the quick ones. As you can tell, I'm not an economist or a historian of economic thought. I'm an archivist. And the sort of thing that gets me out of bed in the morning is what these guys are doing. So I'd like to say thanks to them. And when you see the materials that you've catalogued being used for 30 years, and then people saying there's still a lot more in there to find, that, you know, that is just great for me and just keeps me in the job. So I'd just like to say thank you to all those Sraffians out there who are doing this stuff.
Okay, all right. Well, there are too many questions and too little time. So I think I'm going to address Giovanna's question and Clara's question a little bit because I think they're connected. I think to the question of why Sraffa is important, and I just want to talk about wages here because I think it's of importance to everyone here. And certainly that value is determined through exogenous distribution, which means that either the rate of interest can be given from outside, that is monetary policy, again having a political impact on wages. I think that that is a fundamental insight, unlike what mainstream economists are trying to say. Or secondly, that minimum wages and bargaining for better wages is fair, it is economically reasonable, it is a rational way to go about doing economics, I think is also another insight. Again, all this comes from the surplus approach, which is not really there in the scarcity approach of the marginalist economists. So I think that certainly that is one. The other thing I want to talk about is measurement. Since yesterday we spoke about taxation, there was not so much discussion on depreciation, for instance, and I think the valuation of capital. I think it's extremely important because it has practical consequences. For instance, big businesses can hire expensive CAs and show that they have accelerated depreciation and get a very low tax rate, or they actually pay less taxes. So I think that the question, and I think Sraffa really, mentions it, and I think a lot of work is up for all of us, because theoretical measurements are absolutely important because they have an impact on statistical measurements, which then go into policy making, politics, etc. And I want to mention one more thing, in relation to all this, at least back in India, when people who read Marx tell me that, is Ricardo so important? Right? But I think that what Marx did in his theories of surplus value is to critically engage with all the economists prior to him. And I think that if we want to do serious history of economic thought, we also have to engage seriously with all the economists before Marx and not take Marx for his own word. And especially here, because there was, primitive accumulation, for instance, it's also there in Cantillon, who's coming before Adam Smith. There is a recognition of violence when we are talking about how land has been distributed. And I think finally to expect Sraffa or PCMC to have all the answers that we want of growth, distribution, theory of state, it's impossible. I think Sraffa had a very specific project which he did brilliantly, and I think it's up to people, all of us here, to take that forward in line with Marx or in line with Keletsky or Keynes or Minsky. I think that's an ongoing project.
Okay, me too. I would like to start from the question why Sraffa is important, why Sraffa is relevant. In order to answer this question, we should keep in mind that the classical approach to income distribution, the so-called surplus approach, explains income distribution as a social phenomenon. So there are different social classes with opposite interests, and there is an inverse relationship between the wage rate and the profit rate. And Sraffa's theory of value allows to recover this, allows the recovery of this approach. which was, as Sraffa wrote in the introduction of his book, submerged and forgotten because of the rise of the marginalist approach. Moreover, answering Clara's question, which is the critical contribution. Okay, so first of all, Sraffa provides a different explanation of the working of the capitalist system. The different conception of the production process brings about a different representation of the capitalist system. So income distribution concerns the division of the national output between different social classes. By contrast, in the marginalist approach, income distribution concerns the determination of prices, because the wage rate, interest rate, and rent rate are understood as the prices paid by firms for the use of the factors of production. As for the critical contribution, we know, perhaps the new generations don't know this. I discovered a few days ago during the Young Scholar presentation that after the publication of Sraffa's book in the 1960s, there was a debate between very important scholars, Samuelson and Solo, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Sraffa, John Robinson, Pasinetti, and Garegnani in Cambridge, UK. And during this debate, it was established that the conception of the interest rate as the price for the employment, for the service, the productive contribution of capital leads to paradoxical conclusions. And this is the contribution provided by Sraffa, in my view. Okay.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I mean, there are so many questions. I will try to put all together, beginning with Ricardo Velos Fiores. I mean, I really appreciate your take on all these issues and giving us the opportunity to rejoin. And I mean, I think we are all aware that, I mean, Sraffa was a friend of Gramsci. He helped him materially. He had correspondence. He wrote for the magazine and so on. I mean, I don't think we need to. I mean, as Alex said, it's up to people to make up their mind. So about that, about the critique, yes, following up on the Saverio's, to the Clara's point. So basically the idea is that, you know, you pick supply and demand marginalist analysis, and they would say, okay, distribution will be determined by scarcity and demand, supply and demand curves, and then you can order the different techniques of production according to intensity of factors, right? So more labor intensive, less labor intensive, more capital intensive, and then you link to a certain pattern of distribution, right? So, for example, if a country has many, many workers and less capital, then more labor-intensive techniques should be put in place, right? And so basically the critique of Sraffa and the Cambridge controversy basically destroyed that idea, right? So basically the supply and demand framework basically lost all these foundational principles, right? So that is, which by the way, this came out of the Ricardian law of diminishing returns in land, right? But you know, this is another story because the marginalists actually generalized to all factors of production. So this edifice basically cracked, okay, after Sraffa. About the relevance, I think that this framework is very, very much relevant in terms of none of us talk about the distinction between basics and non-basics commodities, right? So basics commodities are those which determine the rate of profit or rate of surplus in a society, and basic commodities are those which enter both directly and indirectly into the production of all the commodities, right? With that in mind, we can think about, for example, how we can apply those concepts into current issues like, for example, health, right? So health is a basic service from that point of view. Energy production, we were talking about on Thursday on Gelbert's presentation, entropy.
and the limit of nature, which is something that Sraffa acknowledged in one of his manuscripts as well, the limit. So Sraffa destroyed the idea of scarcity in the means of productions because you can, still he noticed the limit of nature. And this is something which I think we can take it seriously from now on. I will stop here, give Scott.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to address these questions. In January of 1957, Sraffa was about to embark on the last leg of actually writing this damn book, okay? He started in 1927, 30 years in different periods of activity. He was at the Isle of Man, he was exiled, he was doing Ricardo works of correspondence, he's doing a lot of things, right? And a busy guy, but also, did enjoy, not having it done too, it seems. But in any event, in 1957, he writes, in January 1957, he writes this one page, and I don't have it up here for you, but it says, just enough to hand it over before going down. Okay, somebody said, just enough to hand it over before going down. Now that's significant for me, okay? Because what that demonstrates to me is that, and I take this from Luigi Passanetti, writes an article in 1988, the Cambridge Journal had their celebratory issue on Sraffa, some really seminal articles are there, one of which is Luigi Passanetti. He writes a really short, he's got a couple of articles in that issue, but a really short article that he writes called Sraffa on Income Distribution, where he says that Sraffa's approach is foundational. So which means that it's a foundational approach, that it is, and the way I see it, just enough to hand it over before going down. He's giving, how I see it, a modern theorist in classical political economy, the rigor, the intellectual rigor, the mathematical rigor too, and we could talk about the role of mathematics in a minute, to be able to solve some of the problems that were never solved in classical political economy. Why? Because in 1870, the entire approach was abandoned. So I agree with my colleague Alex Thomas here that production of commodities is a critique of both classical political economy, a constructive critique, as well as neoclassical economics, which is a destructive critique. I think this notion of critique of economic theory, it didn't say a critique of marginalist economic theory. And I've had this discussion with Heinz in Cambridge before. He's like, Heinz Kurtz, he's like, of course he meant marginalist economic theory. What else? I said, well, maybe he meant economic theory generally. If he meant marginalist economic theory, I'm thinking he would have said it. Okay, now these are the areas of debate. This is going to be what makes Sraffa's scholarship so fascinating for young people out there. It's so fascinating because the archives have been so sequestered, so made difficult to access. Believe me, Ricardo and I and Andres, we've been there before the digitization. Jonathan can attest to this. You had to sit there, you had to write, you couldn't copy, you had to, me and Ricardo are in 2007. We're effing monks here, man. We're in this castle, just writing and transcribing what's already there, and we can't take a picture. So it was like, and so I had thousands of, hundreds of pages of transcriptions where I'm just there writing. I'm just a monk. I'm a scribe. And damn it, I would have done it to the end until eventually they let us have it. So why? What is it, Giovanna? Go back to Wing Lam and Chinese staff and Anwar Sheikh. I don't see Anwar here, I see Wing. I mean, in 1993, 1994, 1996 is when I did the seminar on Marx, Sraffa, and Koletsky for Anwar's class. And so I'm down doing my organizing at Chinese staff, and I'm bringing this little book with me on the picket line. And this book, and between the pickets, I'm looking at this book, and I meant to bring my dog-eared paperback copy, but on that picket line, what I saw was the theory of exploitation. I saw that in these pages, there lied a scientific understanding about the nature of exploitation, and as a worker, who I still identify as, somebody who wants to understand, wants the world to understand that the source of profit comes out of us, not out of the brilliance of Bill Gates or Elon Musk. It comes from the fact that working people are producing more than we are getting, okay? And I saw that in Sraffa. That's what, now, some people don't see that, and that's fine, it's foundational, okay? But once I saw that, forget about it, man. I am not quitting, okay? And if Sraffa would have been Polish, I would have been in Warsaw instead of Rome. Okay, so that's the issue there. So that, for me, that was it. So that's to your question, Giovanna. Matthias, in terms of the histoire, the theories of surplus value, absolutely it had an influence on Sraffa's, especially in the lecture notes on the advanced theory of value that were quoted today, D24. If you look at the first 19 pages of D24, they read a lot like theories of surplus value. Now that's different from the role of the schemes of reproduction, which would De Vivo also said. Now that's a different story, and I'm a little bit more critical of that. To Ricardo, yes, there was no, the 1940s, Sraffa did develop a labor theory of value. He looked at labor. If you know production of commodities by means of commodities, okay, part one is single product industries, which deals with the circulating capital model. Excuse the jargon here, okay? But in that, what Sraffa did is in 6 chapters, he developed the model, 5 of which was what we call a commodity approach, which was all these different equations in these tables. And then the 6th chapter was this approach called the reduction to the dated quantities of labor, or quantities of dated labor. Now, in the 1940s, that dated labor framework was the entire framework from which Sraffa operated. See, he developed his theory from this dated labor concept, which is a Marxian labor value? Well, that's a question, okay, that we can look at. It makes it very robust, very interesting for young scholars to get involved in. But the point is that thousands and thousands of pages that he's writing from 1942 to 1946, 47, 48, that he's developing his analysis in terms of the labor theory of value, or at least the reduction to the labor theory of value. And then in the 1950s, he switches it around to this more cumbersome kind of quantity here, and you got all these different tables in this linear algebra, looks like arithmetic, etc. But in developing this, he did the labor theory of value first, or at least a reduction to dated quantities of labor first. To our colleague from Berkeley, I'm sorry I didn't get your name. I do think that the critiques are absolutely relevant, and this actually speaks to the notion of it being foundational. Sraffa spoke about institutions. He just never wrote about them. He just said, well, what's going to determine the rate of profit? It'll be the institution of the banking sector, or the institution of the money rates of interest. In his archive, he talks about the stock market and the banking system. In production of commodities, he just says the monetary sector. But there is so much institutionalism innate in Sraffa, which goes back to the question about what's behind there. And it goes to Nikos's question at the end here, and that's what I want to put up. This was the missing page that I had here, and I want to say that this is the eigenvalue. So Sraffa did arrive at the eigenvalue. So you can see, let me just see real quick, he didn't do it in the way in which we know in terms of how I did it, but here you can see, I take here, I do this, the inter-industry matrix, I take the thing, I have your maximum eigenvalue right here, and Sraffa arrives at it here. This is in Lent term, I'd say around March, April, May of 1928. It's right there, 1582. Now, he didn't know it to be the eigenvalue, but he intuited what I call a uniform overplus ratio. He knew that there was a surplus production in this economy. Thank you. He knew that there was a surplus production in this economy that we had to get a hold of and grapple with. So for me, Sraffa is foundational. I think that the archive really opens it up for young scholars. I'm too old to be on this. We need young people to be doing it, but young people do not want to study things that they can't access. Right? And they can't do it. And so now, with the access of the digital archive, we hope that in the TOESL arrangement, which I want to talk more about, of course, and I want to acknowledge the digital archivist from University of Tulsa here, Jill Kreff, she's here. We're working on putting together the definitive TOESL arrangement to allow for this type of cogent analysis and scholarship to come out of the Sraffa papers. And that's all I got here.
Sorry, can I say something? Giovanna, can I say one thing? Sorry.
One thing.
Okay. Oh, sorry, yeah, I forgot to address Nico's question. Very interesting, yeah. I think in 1926 paper, I think that Sraffa rejects general equilibrium because of these methodological complications of everything changes at the same time. And so I think on the methodological side, I would say he follows sort of partial equilibrium analysis, although not marginalist. To the colleague from Berkeley's point, and following up on Scott, I think, for example, you can read the lectures on industry, which Sraffa delivered in 1940, right? So there is a lot of institutional analysis in the same vein that you will find in Marx. No worries, yeah.
James Galbraith had an anecdote to tell us.
Yeah, looking out on the youth of this panel and audience, there cannot be very many people here who had the pleasure of meeting Piero Sraffa and getting to know him a little bit, which I did in 1974 at Cambridge. But I want to tell a story that goes back to 1945 or so, when Sraffa did some work on the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which was directed in part by my father. And he came to my father, this is according to family lore, and toward the end of that project, and said he would like permission to fly to Italy. And my father said, Piero, why do you want to fly to Italy? And he said, well, there is going to be a communist revolution in Italy. And as you know, I am a communist, and I wish to go to be there for it. And my father said, Piero, you're asking me to authorize United States Army Air Force transport to take you to the communist revolution in Italy. Piero said, yes. And my father reasoned it the following way. He said, well, two possibilities. The first one is that there is not going to be a communist revolution in Italy. And if I send Piero Sraffa to Italy, that will not make the revolution, which isn't going to happen, happen. And the second possibility is that there is going to be a communist revolution in Italy. And in that case, if Piero Sraffa is there, it will be a better revolution than it would otherwise be. Transport approved.
That was lovely. Wonderful. So now we have a 15-minute coffee break and then the next session on the methods of economic history and history of capitalism. Thank you so much.